Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriel Meyer. I'm the executive director of the Ruskin Art Club, founded here in Los Angeles in 1888. 132 years on, we're still here and championing the perspectives of art and social critic John Ruskin and their relevance to the challenges we face in the 21st century. For our history, information, programs, membership, please visit our website at www.ruskinartclub.com. Tonight, Stuart Denenberg, director of Denenberg Fine Arts, gallery owner, art connoisseur and collector, poet, and impresario, will share with us some of his recent Ruskin acquisitions, especially a rare and remarkable once lost, early Ruskin watercolor. Before Stuart shares, I thought it might be useful to underline a few salient points about Ruskin's drawings in general. While Ruskin continues to attract attention as a thinker, to his notions of the integration of art and life, and as a fearless social critic, especially of the anthropological assumptions of industrial society and laissez-faire capitalism. His own work as an artist, as a Victorian master of drawing, has been largely neglected until recently. That started changing with the great exhibitions of Ruskin's work at the Tate Britain in 2000, under the curatorship of Robert Hewison and Stephen Wildman. Last year's bicentennial exhibitions in various museums around the world celebrated the contemporary appraisal of Ruskin, not only as a champion of Turner and Tintoretto, but as a great artist in his own right. A couple of things to point out about Ruskin's drawings. One is they were never intended to be exhibited, or at least they were drawn for private use rather than public display. Ruskin's father did engrave a number of them, but Ruskin himself seemed remarkably indifferent to them as public art objects. As a whole, they're not finished work, but rather sketches. Ruskin's drawings, these sketches, had three basic purposes. One, as seeing exercises. As part of Ruskin's daily discipline to study nature, to study architecture, to study geology, there's a famous, if often misunderstood, quote from modern painters, his first modern painters, his first masterpiece. This is his advice to young artists, a kind of method of realism as self-education. Quote, "Go to nature in all singleness of heart and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thought but how best to penetrate her meaning and remember her instructions, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, scorning nothing, believing all things to be right and good, and rejoicing always in the truth," end quote. This is Ruskin's whole concept of the innocent eye, the eye that is free from the conventions of art and the models of the past. Ruskin's drawings were also a record of details that interested him. It's why many of his drawings are unfinished. For example, there's a famous drawing of the facade of the Church of San Marco in Venice. He only fills in the architectural details in the facade that he's examining and doesn't bother at all to render the whole facade. So he's always in these studies concerned about some detail that he's looking at carefully. And finally, third, Ruskin's drawings function as a record of buildings, of architectural details that were being or were in danger of being destroyed by modern restorers and developers, particularly in Venice. As Venice was connected to the rest of Italy by railroads and became a tourist destination in the mid-19th century, the city underwent massive restoration. That's in quotes, which meant the razing of many Renaissance and late Gothic buildings that Ruskin loved. Ruskin began to draw these structures and architectural details, fresco cycles, particular oddities of construction, as a way of preserving their memory for future generations. He also commissioned his students to rescue the memories of historic structures slated for demolition. For example, the Mercato Vecchio in Florence, which was demolished in the 1870s. Ruskin sent a number of his drawing students there to record the old market. The most famous of these rescues was saving San Marco from restoration in the 1870s. The plan was to cover the, quote, inconsistencies of the facade with new marble facing to give it a neat, uniform, and regular appearance. Ruskin launched an immediate campaign with William Morris and with the full support of many diplomats and embassies around the world to prevent this restoration of the magnificent, irregular, crazy quilt facade of San Marco. Ultimately, that was successful. As I've often said, Ruskin will go to heaven for that alone. A quote from The Stones of Venice. Nothing must come between nature and the artist's sight. Nothing between God and the artist's soul. Neither calculation nor hearsay, be it the most subtle of calculations or the wisest of sayings, may be allowed to come between the universe and the witness which art brings to its visible nature. The whole value of that witness depends on its being eyewitness. The genuineness, acceptableness, and dominion of it depend on the personal assurance of the man who utters it. All its victory depends on the veracity of one preceding word, vidi, I saw. Stuart, take it away.
Wonderful, Gabriel. I learn so much every time I talk to you and I listen to you. Well, as an art collector and an art dealer, typically I hunt and gather. And in the case of John Ruskin, I came to him and he came to me in a rather roundabout way. And I want to discuss that, as I find it interesting. And I take the opportunity to discuss issues of authenticity and provenance in the matter of a watercolor attributed to John Ruskin. If genuine, this piece had been lost from public view for over 180 years. I'll present evidence of Ruskin's empathy and aesthetic resonance with Turner, and in particular, his experience of the Loire River watercolors Turner executed around 1826 to 1830 on a journey through France. But my path to an interest in Ruskin was not a straight road, and here I reference Ruskin's preference for the richness and randomness of meandering in nature over the mechanical efficiency of modern highways. A road may well be the quickest way to go from point A to point B, but from Ruskin's perspective, it is a pointless way to travel. Allow me to take a few first steps as background with you on my path to Ruskin. When I lived in San Francisco, some 20 years ago, I was called to do an appraisal for James Nichols, in whose photography studio I saw hanging an exquisite small drawing by Khalil Gibran, the author of The Prophet, whose estate I represent. Soon the drawing came to rest in the Gibran estate, and Jim became a friend. A journalist named Gabriel Meyer invited Jim to photograph the war in Sudan, to illustrate a book-length report he was writing at the invitation of the Bishop of the Sudan. When the book was published soon after my move to Los Angeles, we invited Gabriel to do a book signing in the gallery and to do a reading. Through Gabriel's leadership of the Ruskin Art Club, it was wonderful to discover the mind of John Ruskin. As our interest developed, we decided to take advantage of an academic tour a year and a half ago to Ruskin's England with Jim Spates, a great Ruskin scholar, and Nicholas Friend, an academic organizer of such travel. And here I want to say a brief word of concern for the speedy recovery of Jim Spates after his mild stroke. We're all thinking of you, Jim. Well, what soon followed our trip was a burgeoning interest in all things Ruskin. First, an amazing art discovery at auction, which I'll tell you about, and then a few months later in a New York gallery, not one, but two of an edition of only 6 cast bronze portraits of Ruskin by the American sculptor Gutzon Borglum. One of these bronzes stayed in California and is in Gabriel's collection. The other was acquired by a group of friends of Brentwood, Ruskin's legendary home, and donated to that home in Coniston, placed near the very chair in which Ruskin posed. And this is a portrait of Ruskin by Borglum in bronze, looking very grand, majestic. The beat goes on. Continuing on the path, a few weeks ago, a friend of mine came to visit with a cache of photographs he had for sale, among which were a vintage albumen photograph of Ruskin and Dante Gabriel Rossetti posed together in Rossetti's garden at Cheyne Walk, as well as a vintage platinum print of William Morris in a famous pose, and he was willing to do a trade. Well, here are these 2 rare vintage photographs now in our collection. This is a photograph by William Downey, John Ruskin and Rossetti, but without William Bell Scott. And I would like to turn this over to Gabriel for a minute to discuss the absence of Scott, the man you see here on the left, somehow literally excised from that photograph. Gabriel?
Yes, well, yes, William Bell Scott was a early friend of the pre-Raphaelites, and this was quite a wide group of friends and hangers-on as well. And Bell Scott was an early kind of hangers-on, and when Ruskin got involved, it was one of those situations where the two of them basically hated each other on sight. And Ruskin offended him by some offhand comment, and then Scott enjoyed giving back as good as he got as well. And particularly by tweaking Ruskin with stories, not so edifying stories about his hero, Turner. And as one comment says, Dante Gabriel Rossetti later on commented that Ruskin's face was a study to see as he reacted to William Bell Scott's less than positive comments about his artistic hero. So that may have had a role in Bell Scott's removal from this photograph.
It's very interesting to contemplate how indeed the photograph was altered. Was it altered in the negative, or individual albumens such as this one actually cut? One doesn't know. Well, about Downey and his brother, Daniel Downey and William, were partners. Their photo studio in Newcastle on Tyne, England, had branches in London. They were known for portraits of aristocracy and royalty, Queen Victoria, the Sultan of Turkey, Napoleon III, all subjects. And they were named official photographers of the royal family in 1893. This double portrait of Ruskin and Rossetti during the session at Rossetti's house was held on June 29th, 1863, quite early in Downey's career. He also photographed Ruskin in Rossetti's painting chair. Jerry Moss, a delightful colleague, commented about the double portrait I've just shown you. Rossetti's handkerchief hangs out sloppily, and he stands awkwardly. And furthermore, Downey objected to the menacing way Ruskin held his stick. He also wanted him seated. Sit? In the presence of Rossetti, never. Ruskin and his circle from Moss. Downey prevailed for the single photograph of Ruskin by himself. We're lucky to have this vintage photograph. And there we are again with the rather ferocious looking William Bell Scott to the left. I also was able to acquire a gorgeous platinum photograph in the most famous pose of William Morris, taken by Frederick Hollier. Hollier was an English photographer and engraver, known for his photographic reproductions of paintings and drawings, particularly those of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as well as for portraits of literary and artistic figures of late Victorian and Edwardian London. The artists that Hollier photographed were a diverse group encompassing members of the arts and crafts movement, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, aestheticism, impressionism, and the Royal Academy. Morris features in several portraits done by Hollier. Well, the path continues, nothing like a straight road. I had actually made 2 runs at owning a drawing by Ruskin, both unsuccessful. Here's the first. At auction, a lovely drawing of the Cathedral at Sens, the first Gothic cathedral in France. It soared, went right past any budget I had for it. But it's a gorgeous thing, and you can see the level of detail Ruskin embellished, Ruskin lavished on this drawing, leaving, as Gabe had suggested, much of it unfinished, but focusing on the statuary and the architectural ornament. The second drawing was a gallery's offering. They had 6 Ruskin drawings. One was within the budget. Very charming. I show it to you here, just a branch of leaves, but so meticulously done, almost photorealistically, and yet a certain spirit in here's 2.5 by 3.5 inches. I couldn't do it. It was quite a bit of money, and it was a very tiny work. Well, then appearing to this hunter-gatherer, as I say, art dealer, collector, browsing auction catalogs for profit and pleasure, a gorgeous watercolor in a Chicago auction showed up, but merely, quote, attributed to John Ruskin. Now, one has to understand that designation by an auction or a gallery of a work of art as attributed or school of or circle of an artist simply means that the attribution cannot be fully relied upon as a guarantee of authenticity. And without authenticity, market value is at risk. So it's a double-edged sword. Exciting discoveries are occasionally made by risk takers. I'm going to tell you about one problem having to do with authenticity, as I promised. An illuminating meander on this path, the thorny issue of authenticity, is illustrated when I opened my gallery in Boston in 1965. I was soon appraising old master prints and drawings for the Fogg Museum. A private dealer I knew in New Haven called to ask, might I have a client for a Rembrandt drawing? Joseph before Pharaoh, very exciting. And to confirm its authenticity, he had on the phone Dr. Egbert Haverkamp Begemann, a distinguished art historian on Rembrandt, who said to me in this inimitable, or shall I say imitable German accent, "Yeah, I lean cautiously toward accepting the drawing." Oh, well, that was very exciting. But like a Harvard-Yale football game, I had to ask if I could show the work to my friend, Professor Seymour Slive, the distinguished Harvard professor equally famous for expertise on Rembrandt drawings. The drawing was sent. I showed it to Slive, who said, and I quote, "I lean cautiously toward rejecting the drawing." Apparently, my lesson was that expertise in the world of old masters consisted of cautious leaning. Well, back to the drawing attributed to John Ruskin. As it happens, fortunately, I had met the author of the auction catalog essay, the great expert on Ruskin, Stephen Wildman, on the Ruskin journey to England, and I asked Gabriel for a formal introduction to Stephen through Robert Hewison, happily provided. I hoped perhaps Dr. Wildman would be more forthcoming than the catalog entry. Was his positive opinion 50-50 or better? Would he make a stronger commitment before I entered the bidding? In the conversation, it was a little unsettling to hear him say he had nothing to add to the essay, which I quote below at length. Attributed to the artist John Ruskin, Amboise depicts the late 15th century Saint Hubert's chapel, which rises above the Chateau of Amboise along the River Loire in France. According to Wildman, emeritus professor of history of art, Lancaster University, The lesser detail, especially in the foreground, points to this watercolor possibly being an early attempt at the more detailed and finished watercolor, also titled Amboise, dating from 1841 and in a private collection. The known watercolor was shown in the 2000 exhibition, Ruskin, Turner, and the Pre-Raphaelites, held at the Tate, London. It's in Robert Hewison and Morrill and Stephen Wildman's book, illustrated on page 64, number 40. The present Amboise watercolor falls within the period of the early 1840s, when Ruskin was deeply influenced by the work of Joseph Mallard William Turner, to the extent of attempting to capture Turner's style. This is kind. Worrell actually says that these early watercolors veer on caricature. I disagree. In the process, Ruskin adopted and exaggerated the artist's mannerisms, including his propensity to distort the height of architectural motifs. Indeed, in Praeterita, Ruskin writes, describing a lost preparatory drawing for the finished watercolor as, quote, highly labored and, quote, out of my head, representing the castle as about 700 feet above the river. It is perhaps only 80 or 90, with sunset light on it in imitation of Turner. This is Ruskin still talking. And the moon rising behind it in imitation of Turner. And some steps and balustrades, which are not there, going down to the river in imitation of Turner, with the fretwork of St. Hubert's Chapel done very carefully in my own way. I thought, perhaps a little better than Turner. Quoted in the works of John Ruskin by Wedderburn and Cook, Praeterita, 1908, page 302. Fascinating. The supposition that the present watercolor is that first effort is supported by the fact that a greater degree of detail would indeed have been needed for conversion into an engraving. Engravings require more particularized visual elements to translate well into a finished print. This would have led Ruskin to complete a more finished version of Amboise. There is an engraving, and it was executed by Frederick Goodall, used to accompany Ruskin's long poem, The Broken Chain, published under the quiet signature, J.R., Christ Church, Oxford, in the Annuals of Friendship's Offering, between 1840 and 1843, part 5, 14, including the lines from poems 2, lines 169, 70, as follows. Those orbed towers, obscure and vast, that light the Loire with sunset blast. Those fretted groups of shaft and spire that crest Amboise's cliff with fire, when, far beneath, in moonlight, fail the winds that shook the pausing sail, the panes that tint with dyes divine the altar of St. Hubert's shrine. About the scene, Ruskin further declared that the chapel which crowns the precipice, though small, is one of the loveliest bits of rich detail in France. In reality, it is terminated by a small wooden spire, quote, which I have not represented as it destroyed the grandeur of the outline. Again, quoting Wedderburn and Cook, Ruskin, The Poems, 1903. The influence of Turner is particularly apparent in the atmospheric quality of the watercolor. Ruskin demonstrates an expressive handling of his medium to denote boulders on the left-hand side of the composition, deep shadows and long reflections in the water below. I'm still quoting Wildman. This, combined with the delicate handling of the castle and the foreground details, creates an almost ethereal and otherworldly feel. The contrast between light and dark, moonlight and shade further demonstrate the influence of Turner's Impressionist works. Turner had painted Amboise, and Ruskin's intention was unashamedly to emulate Turner's grand style. He quotes the provenance and exhibition history of that watercolor, and I present it to you here. I won't bother to read it on to you, but it was sold at Sotheby's most recently in 1983 and entered a private collection in this country, in the United States, and is still there as far as we know. It was shown at the Tate and so forth. Frustrated in hope of more certainty, I sought another opinion. And I showed the image, which I have not shown to you yet. I have shown the image to Robert Flynn Johnson, Curator Emeritus of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Art and Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco, the largest collection of works on paper west of the Mississippi. Well, he said he thought the watercolor was nice enough, but disappointingly, he said it's more Turner than Ruskin. I then asked my friend, Professor Norman Weiss, his opinion. He's a polymath and a collector teaching architectural preservation at Columbia University and was in fact the best man at my marriage 37 years ago. Norman was familiar with Ruskin for many reasons and quipped, well, I would call this a Turkin Rustner, more or less echoing the slightly disparaging comments of Robert Johnson. Back to square one. What about provenance? Provenance, the history of ownership of a work of art. That's important and valuable information, often critical. So I called the auction house to ask what they could tell me. And they confided that it came from the same collection as a painting in the same sale by Eugène de Blanc, with a provenance listed as by descent after having been purchased at the Cooling Gallery, London. Nothing more. They were kind enough to tell me the unpublished name of the consignor, Kathleen Madden Turner, heir to the prominent Madden family of Indiana, married name Turner, stranger than fiction. I now knew that the watercolor was likely acquired in London and possibly at the same dealer, the Cooling Gallery. So let's find out about the Cooling Gallery. Well, John Albert Cooling was in business beginning in 1884, at the height of Ruskin's fame, and 6 years only before his death. This suggested to me the likelihood that the gallery could well have had Ruskin works of art, and this watercolor might well have been in stock when they moved to their new Bond Street premises in 1911, and the Maddens could have purchased the work from them at the same time as the de Blanc painting. The picture, so to speak, is becoming clearer, but a decision had to be made in the absence of proof. I thought I'd better inform my own visual expertise by looking at a predecessor of Ruskin, somebody Ruskin looked at and diverged from, Samuel Prout, a great English watercolorist, to see where Ruskin's work took him, to look at Turner watercolors of the d'Amboise, the Chateau d'Amboise, to see what he saw, how he recorded it, and to read about Ruskin's history of engagement with Turner's Loire watercolors. Ruskin was a well-practiced and obsessive artist, although he never considered himself to be a professional. Nonetheless, he was the first Slade School professor of fine art, and terribly important to so many. He was motivated in his early work by a need to impress his parents, with whom he was very close and who actually traveled with him on the Loire River journey of 1840, where this watercolor might have been executed. He was all of 21 years of age. I needed to look at more of his work and use my good eye in the absence of certainty. Using and making daguerreotypes may well have influenced Ruskin's move from the style of Samuel Prout. I show you one of Prout's brilliant architectural renderings below. Might have motivated Ruskin to a more truthful style of painting based on nature, an intense observation of nature. Of course, that influenced the entire pre-Raphaelite movement. As you can see, the Prout is highly detailed and something almost mechanical about it, and very little nature, if you will. Ruskin's 1843 book, Modern Painters, in the main is a defense of Turner, of whom Ruskin became a devotee. He took from Turner an interest in atmospheric effects and radical realism in both visual and written accounts of the way we see and are to see. Ruskin's own watercolors manifest broken passages and variations between tight detail and broad impression, as quoted from Dr. James McCardle in an essay on Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelites and photography in the blog On This Day. Photography, I recommend it to you. It's a very charming blog. In early 1840, October, touring the Loire River, Ruskin and his parents visited Blois, Amboise, and Tours so that he could see the places depicted by Turner as well as sketch for himself. Is it possible the present watercolor was one of those sketches that young Ruskin accomplished on the tour? Well, Ruskin wrote of the significance of Turner's views, claiming the engraved images of the Loire had become, quote, the criterion of all beauty today. Indeed, after returning from the 1840 trip, he included the Loire views in a list of engravings he told his good friend, Edward Clayton, to consult in order to appreciate Turner's unique qualities. Clayton was his contemporary at Christ Church and one of his closest Oxford friends. He received a note from Ruskin. Take them, meaning the engravings, to bed with you. Look at them before you go to sleep, until you dream of them. And when you're reading and come to anything that you may want to refer to often, put a little Turner engraving in to keep the place that your eye may fall on it whenever you open. Ruskin was so inspired by these Loire engravings after his first celebrated meeting of Turner on June 22nd, 1840, at the house of picture dealer Thomas Griffith. The journey to the Loire in October followed with the engraved images brimming in Ruskin's mind's eye. Well, more evidence was accruing. Around 1841-43, Ruskin chose to paint that more detailed watercolor view of the Chateau d'Amboise at sunset, quote, with the moon rising in the distance and shining through a bridge, in order to be engraved by Goodall, as we had discussed, commissioned by his father, James Ruskin. Ruskin himself didn't care to bother. Reading this, I was becoming more convinced that the attribution was accurate, that this emotional watercolor was the missing masterpiece. But I had to see all of Turner's efforts at Amboise first. I searched, found, and ordered Ian Worrell's extensive book on the watercolors, Turner on the Loire. Of the greatest interest was the one that was ultimately engraved. And Worrell tells us that, quote, generally, Ruskin preferred the less obviously finished subjects of Turner. To my mind, this further supported the attribution of the candidate watercolor. This indeed is the Turner watercolor engraved by Goodall. Very unfinished, in fact. This is the engraving, yeah, highly detailed and added to, no doubt, by Goodall in his work. I learned that Ruskin eventually actually acquired 48 of these Loire watercolors, paying well over market at the time, despite or because his father had rejected their acquisition at half the price years earlier. It's important to understand, as most Ruskinians understand, that Ruskin's father, James, was a partner in the Domecq Sherry Company in England, the great importer of sherry. And when he passed away in the 1860s, left Ruskin an immense fortune, the equivalent of something like 60 or $70 million today, which would have gone tremendously far in England in the mid-century. And so he could easily acquire Turner, and indeed he did. It was Ruskin's decision to donate all of these to Oxford's Ashmolean in hopes that others would gain from the, quote, simple and at first unattractive drawings of the Loire series. Recorded by Worrell that his favorite of the 48 was the distant view on the Loire of the Chateau de Clermont. This being a very, it's not a great photograph, but it shows you how very atmospheric, how very rudimentary the forms are, but how suffused with light they are as well. Ruskin encouraged others to copy these in order to understand how Turner placed distinct colors next to each other, and claimed his chief motives lay in the infallible decision and extreme modesty in color of the group. Quote, they are beyond all other works that I know existing, dependent for their effect on low subdued tones, their favorite choice in time of day, being either dawn or twilight, and even their brightest sunsets produced chiefly on gray paper. Reflecting on his gift to Oxford, he wrote later in Force Clavigera, when I gave away my Loire series of Turner drawings, I thought I was rational enough to enjoy them as much in the university gallery as in my own study, but not at all. I find I can't bear to look at them in the gallery. They are mine no more. Well, I made my decision and I bid. This one was going to be mine. There was one other bidder, but I prevailed. Ruskin's great watercolor of the Chateau d'Amboise was indeed mine. But was it Ruskin? Well, okay. Stephen Wildman asked me to let him know if I was successful. I emailed and heard back almost immediately that he was delighted. And most excitingly, he said, it could not be by anybody else. Because it had been offered, you see, in a commercial venue as an academic, he did not want to submit more committed language in the essay. He added, at the end of our conversation, and to my satisfaction, had it been at auction in England, I would have been tempted myself. How fantastic. The watercolor is absolutely genuine. It joins the distinguished group of works of art by the prodigy whom Count Leo Tolstoy, no less, called one of the most remarkable men, not only of England, but of our generation, but of all countries and all times. I shall keep you in suspense no longer. You are among the very first to see Ruskin's watercolor Chateau d'Amboise, since it disappeared in 1840. The Ruskin watercolor, There's its provenance, and there it is. Absolutely stunning. You can see the moon peeking above the bridge, which looks like an aqueduct. You see the chateau towering. You see the movements of the foreground. There are actually figures. If you look closely with a lens, you can see figures moving in the landscape, and beautifully framed as well. There's a detail. You see how he picks out the frets, the spires, the ornament, but everything is moving, everything is rising. The later watercolor, engraved by Goodall, is more detailed. It has more specific artifacts, the boats, the dock, and so on. And I'm going to show you both at once and ask which you prefer. Personally, I prefer mine, not because it's mine, but because it has a kind of in the Barbizon time, when artists would go out into the Barbizon forest with a simple panel and paints and brushes. They would paint right immediately what they saw, and it was called premier coup. All at once, the first blow, the first stroke, the first sight. And to me, the watercolor I have is a premier coup. It's a very fresh and very spontaneous, a very emotional piece, I believe. To conclude, who better than Ruskin from modern painters? Quote, and in his American notes, I remember Dickens notices the same truth, describing himself as lying drowsily on the barge deck, looking not at, but through the sky. And if you look intensely at the pure blue of a serene sky, you will see that there is a variety and fullness in its very repose. It is not flat, dead color, but a deep, quivering, transparent body of penetrable air, in which you trace or imagine short, falling spots of deceiving light and dim shades, faint, veiled vestiges of dark vapor. And it is this trembling transparency which our great modern master has especially aimed at and given. His blue is never laid on in smooth coats, but in breaking, mingling, melting hues, a quarter and an inch of which, cut off from all the rest of the picture, is still spacious, still infinite and immeasurable in depth. It is a painting of the air, something into which you can see, through the parts which are near you, into those which are far off, something which has no surface, and through which we can plunge far and farther and without stay or end into the profundity of space. Thank you very much. Gabriel? Gabriel, do you want to conclude? You're muted. You're muted, Gabriel.
Yes. Well, no, I don't need to conclude. Ruskin has concluded it for all of us.
Okay, great. Perfect. Well, thanks. We did it.
We did it. Hold on. Let me stop the. Oh, that does that. Okay. Very good.
Okay.
Well, we will. Let me stop the recording.